into the second day of the experiment. Third day, sorry, we started Monday. Before I turn it over to Charlie to tell us about gerrymandering, we're going to have a little bit of a lesson on the use of a microphone. So if you see how I'm holding it, this is how you need to hold it. You don't hold it down like this. You have to aim it right to your mouth. And I think what happens is sometimes people start hearing themselves and then they want to get it away. But you're supposed to hear yourself. So this is the proper use of the microphone. It's like you having an ice cream cone. So will everybody please turn off your cell phones so we don't have any annoying noises? And with that, I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can you all hear me? Is this volume level okay?
No.
You want to be louder?
The microphone isn't.
No, my microphone's a lapel, but
Yeah, well, it's not close enough. Or something.
okay, well,
Or something.
I'm fine, I think.
Not any better.
Is this different? Is this better?
No.
Maybe Ed, you know what? Oh, you're there. See, there's a danger of getting a little bit of feedback if it's too loud. What do you think? Can you hear?
No.
Some say no, some say yes. I wonder if you think we ought to change microphones, or should we go ahead with this?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, the advice is to go ahead. I will try to talk a little louder. I'm worried about getting feedback, but we'll go ahead. So, okay. Topic today: Pennsylvania's legislature and elections, gerrymandering, dysfunction, and proposals for reform, and why this matters to us. A few years ago, leaders of several Pennsylvania good government organizations realized that they needed to work together more effectively to bring about a more responsive legislature, and they used this as a starting point. No matter what single issue is important to you, if we don't have a responsive legislature, it doesn't matter. Nothing changes unless this changes. So out of this came an organization called Fair Districts Pennsylvania. It's a creature of the Pennsylvania League of Women Voters. It's an offshoot of that organization, founded about 10 years ago. It's nonpartisan, fact-based, it's focused on improving government, and there's a couple of dozen participating organizations. Some of them are featured here. So, a warning having to do with our current times. Beware the bright and shiny object syndrome. We're all aware of the turmoil in Washington, dominating the news cycle on an hour-to-hour basis. It creates the impression that the federal level is all that matters when it comes to government. But there's a lot that goes on at the state level. It's not as dramatic as the news out of Washington, but it very much affects our day-to-day lives. So I'm asking you to put aside the national and the international news for a little while and focus on something closer to home, the state government. So why care about the state legislature? By the way, note that when the State House and the State Senate are referred to together, they're known as the General Assembly, because I'll be talking about the General Assembly from time to time today. Just quickly, here's a few of its duties. Lawmaking, rulemaking, providing checks and balances on the governor, taxing at the state level and spending funds, distributing Pennsylvania's share of the federal funds. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't realize. 40% of our state budget is federal money. It comes from the federal government through the state and then goes out to various places throughout the state. So the debate that's going on in Washington is going to have a very big effect on the state budget, depending on what emerges from that big, not so beautiful bill. Legislature also sets the ground rules for elections, and it initiates constitutional amendments, as well as designing election districts. State legislature raises money from us and spends it, of course. It has a major role in distributing federal funding, as I mentioned a minute ago. State definitely spends their taxes, and the state legislature has a major role in deciding where within the state and on what the money gets spent. Here's some of the major funding that comes to the state to be distributed to counties, to the cities, school districts, and individuals. Health and hospitals, Medicaid, education, social services, public safety, transportation, infrastructure, community development, environment, and conservation. There's a lot there. So the makeup of the State House and the Senate impacts the distribution of funds around the state. Factors like the urban and suburban and rural balance, the balance between Democrats and Republicans, and the balance in political outlook between liberals and conservatives. Who is sitting in those two bodies and how they got there really matters. Okay, so with that as introduction, as a beginning, here's a couple of introductions. Well, first, about the balance in the General Assembly. A swing of only 2 senators could change the leadership of the state Senate, given the lieutenant governor's ability to break a tie. So it could be 25 to 25 with the lieutenant governor breaking the tie. And in the House, 102 Democrats to 101 Republicans, margin of only 1. So it can easily change. So here's some introductions. 2 figures that factor into our discussion today. One is from the 18th and 19th centuries, and the other one is from the 21st century. The earlier individual, shown on the left, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a founding father. He was a merchant, politician, and a diplomat. He served as governor of Massachusetts from 1810 to 1812. He lost his bid for re-election, but he went on to become vice president of the United States under President James Madison. He served there rather briefly from 1813 until his untimely death from a heart attack a year later. The 21st century individual, who's on the right, worked in politics and gained a reputation as a very skilled strategist. His work included helping to secure George W. Bush's victory over Al Gore in 2000 and over John Kerry 4 years later in 2004. He was sometimes called Bush's brain because of his influence on the president's political decisions. He's regarded as one of the most influential Republican strategists of all time. So now let's meet. First is Elbridge Gerry, governor of Massachusetts from 1810 to 1812. In 1812, while Gerry was governor, his party, which was the Democratic Republicans, re-blew the state Senate district map to favor themselves over the opposing Federalist Party. The new district boundaries were highly irregular. They were strategically drawn to concentrate the opposing Federalist voters in as few districts as possible, thereby giving his party, the Democratic Republicans, an advantage in more districts. One particular district in Essex County was so oddly shaped that it resembled a salamander. A political cartoonist at the time exaggerated the shape into a dragon-like creature, softened the hard G, and called it a gerrymander, a blend of Gerry's name and salamander. The name stuck, and ever since, gerrymandering has referred to the manipulation of electoral district boundaries for political gain. That's Karl Rove. The Republican Party created Operation Red Map, which stands for Redistricting Majority Project. In the 2010 election cycle, it marked one of the most strategic and effective uses of redistricting in modern American politics. With Karl Rove in a key role, the GOP used Red Map to redraw congressional maps in their favor, which ensured a structural advantage in the U.S. House of Representatives for years. Rove recognized that control over state legislatures and other places of state legislatures is key, but that would grant the GOP the power to redraw the congressional districts, the U.S. level congressional districts in 2011, after the 2010 U.S. Census. He stressed the importance of winning state legislative races. He noted that he who controls redistricting can control Congress. He drove Republican efforts to invest in state-level elections. The GOP identified a handful of states where legislative control could be flipped, and then they heavily funded key races in those states, and that included Pennsylvania. Then the newly elected legislators could use high-tech mapping software down to the individual block level to create districts that would benefit them. It worked, and it's still working. In Pennsylvania, it worked very well until 2018, when Pennsylvania's Supreme Court decision brought it to an end at the federal level, but it persisted within the state. So it took a few years for the Democrats to catch up and to catch on, but in 2017, former President Barack Obama and former Attorney General Eric Holder took the lead in forming the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, again pursuing the same goals. But like Red Map, that strategy was very selective about states, and Pennsylvania was one of those states. Unfortunately, it was a little too late, because the redistricting had already happened back in 2011. And it was too late to change it until the next round in 2021. So the effects of this activity were, first, Republicans gained control of the U.S. House from 2010 to 2018, which reflected their successes in the 2011 redistricting. By 2018, Democrats had caught on to those tactics and had some successes of their own. 2018 in Pennsylvania, the party balance in the state Supreme Court, very important, changed in favor of the Democrats. Yes, our Supreme Court can act in a very partisan manner if it wants to. And that new court was not tolerant of Republican-created gerrymanders. So in response to a case brought by the Pennsylvania League of Women Voters and others, the court redrew the congressional districts. That created a fair balance among our congressmen. However, more recently, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that while racially based gerrymandering is still unconstitutional, partisan gerrymandering is not. That decision in the South Carolina case rejected claims by black voters that a redrawn district was a racial gerrymander, which would not have been allowed. Instead, and this seems kind of ridiculous, the justices accepted arguments by South Carolina lawmakers that they had actually redrawn the district's boundaries merely to create a partisan advantage for a GOP incumbent, something which the court has prohibited under their recent decisions. That led to this cartoon, this time turning Governor Barry Salamander into a Republican-created monster bird, intimidating the Supreme Court. So how does gerrymandering actually work? Here's a somewhat simplified explanation. If you look at the graphic on the left, that's this one. Imagine this as a map, an aerial view, if you will, of the sample state, simplified for discussion. You see 50 voters, that's 50 little squares, who are to be divided into 5 districts. 20 voters belong to the Green Party, 30 belong to the Orange Party.
Oh, that's cute.
So imagine you have the power to draw the election district lines. If district lines are drawn the way they are in the second graphic on the left, it's over here, they're drawn vertically from top to bottom. You come up with 2 districts on the left side that reliably elect green candidates, and 3 on the right that reliably elect orange candidates. You have a legislature that's 40% green and 60% orange, which reflects the political preferences of the state. Now look at the third graphic from the left. Here the lines are drawn horizontally. In this map, green loses all the elections, despite having 40% of the voters, and the legislature turns out to be 100% orange. However, if the lines are drawn the way they are on the example all the way to the right, green wins, pointer here. It turns out that green wins 3 districts, and orange only wins 2 districts, despite having 60% of the votes. Running down the right-hand side there. So how it works, first you put most of the orange voters into just 2 districts on the right side of the graphic. That's called packing a district. And then you put the remainder of the orange people, the orange voters, into green districts, which gives you, in the green district, typical green district, gives you 60% of the population is green and only 40% is orange. So that's how gerrymandering works. You give a minority of the voters the power of the majority in the legislature. So you see with lines drawn differently, the same group of voters will yield vastly different results. Nothing has changed except for the lines are drawn. This also shows a limitation of getting out the votes campaigns. Where the split is 60% to 40% or wider, it becomes almost impossible to overturn the election pattern in a given district. So we see here this marks a change in the way elections work, turning the traditional concept of elections on its head.
Yeah.
Politicians are picking their voters rather than the voters picking the politicians.
Wow.
Let's just break for a minute. If you have questions or comments or anything, here's an opportunity to raise them. Susan. Is this echo a little annoying? Oh, okay.
You ready for a question, Charlie?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
The map on the right, the diagram on the right. So how I don't even know how to put this question. How do they draw the maps so they do that? Who draws the maps?
When the legislators draw them, legislative staffs, of course, and consultants do the drawing. That's really.
That's terrible.
Oh, you just turned it up. Oh. How's that? I'll keep talking. I'll try to raise my voice. Anyway, it's the high tech mapping that makes the difference. They can drill down to the block level, and it's just tremendous detail, and get that. You get the 60-40 balance. Pretty much guarantees that the majority candidate is always going to win, unless you have a really terrible candidate.
This is sort of a different question. You said we get 40% of our money from the federal government.
Yes.
How much does Pennsylvania give to the federal government?
Pennsylvania doesn't give to the federal government. Pennsylvania citizens get taxed, of course.
Yes.
And we are basically a donor state, not a recipient state. Yeah. By and large, the Mid-Atlantic and the northern tier of states give more money in taxes
than they get in return.
Benefits. And by and large, the southern states and some of the western states get more.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's not fair to us.
Charlie, are you saying that there's a computer program that can make the distribution in favor of one party or the other?
Yes, absolutely.
Some of those things are bizarre. I used to say that my living room was in one district and my bedroom was in another district. I mean, I'm very close to that.
Yeah, I'll show you a map in a minute that shows how absurd it can get to be.
Does the state census have any effect on the voting maps?
Well, the state census simply determines, who lives where, and then it's up to the legislature and its assistants and technical support to figure out how to split that into congressional districts. Okay, well, let's move on. We'll talk about redistricting a little. It's required by federal and state constitutions after the census every 10 years. Make sure each district has as close to an equal population as possible. The process of drawing the district boundaries is left up to each state. Pennsylvania happens to have a separate and distinct process for redrawing the U.S. congressional districts on one hand and the state legislative districts on the other. But it all boils down to the same thing. Politicians are in control. In the U.S. Congress, the census figures set the number of districts in Pennsylvania. That's determined just by the national census. We get our allocation of districts. Then there's a normal procedure in the General Assembly. A bill is introduced with maps. It's deliberated on, it's voted on by both houses, and it's signed or it's vetoed by the governor. And if there's no agreement, it winds up in the courts who have to make the decision. For the House and the Senate at the state level, it's different. They're drawn by a legislative reapportionment commission. That's a commission of 5 individuals made up of 2 leaders from the Senate, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, and 2 leaders from the House. Again, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. The 5th commission member is the chair, and those 4 party leaders are supposed to agree on who's going to be the chair. Well, lots of luck with that. They will always wind up in a stalemate. When they're deadlocked, can't agree, then the chair is chosen by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So the chair becomes essentially a moderator and a tiebreaker. So these people's task is to draw 50 Senate and 203 House districts. So the rules in the Pennsylvania House and Senate allow a very small minority to dictate what bills can reach the floor, including the redistricting bills. In the State House, so much power is concentrated in the hands of a few leaders that lobbyists can focus all their lobbying and money on a select few. So gerrymandering sets the stage for a vicious cycle of unfair rules that block legislation. The leaders draw the maps in order to protect the incumbents. The majority caucus leaders control the rules. To protect their power, they make sure that the rules block reform, and then the leaders draw the districts to protect the situation. Now, there are ground rules for drawing electoral districts. The state constitution requires that districts have equal population and that they be compact, which means shape something like a circle or an oval or a square, contiguous, all the locations must touch each other, and coterminous, that is, the boundaries should match as closely as possible existing boundaries, such as county and township or school district lines. That's the theory. Here's the reality. If you followed the papers a few years ago, this one got a lot of notoriety, but there were others that were just as bad. This is the Pennsylvania 7th Congressional District. Believe it or not, that is all one district. In one case, the connection between the 2 larger plows was just a street, but technically they were all connected to each other. It's not exactly compact, contiguous, or coterminous, but it favored the party in power, which happened to be Republicans. Unless you think I'm siding with the Democrats, let me stress, both parties use gerrymandering to cement control. This is a Democratic one from Maryland, which has since been redrawn more favorably. But again, that's all one district. There's cartoons about the other districts. As a matter of fact, Fair Districts Pennsylvania actually produced a real jigsaw puzzle with actual Pennsylvania congressional districts, some of which look very much like what we see here. This is all had an effect. Before that Supreme Court ruling in Pennsylvania back in 2016, the actual vote for the congressional districts, for the congressional representation, was as shown in the left-hand pie chart here. Roughly 50-50. It was actually 54% Republican to 46% Democrat. But through gerrymandering, it produced a congressional delegation that gave Republicans 13 seats and the Democrats just 5. So this led to the case I mentioned, which reached the state Supreme Court in 2018. And the court ruled, no surprise, that the congressional map was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court then redrew the maps, resulting after the next election, in 2018, looking like this. Again, with the total vote in the state that was roughly split between Democrats and Republicans, 45-55% balance in the pie chart on the left, the result was an even split in terms of representatives elected. We went from a 13-5 in balance to a 50-50 balance in our congressional delegation. Overall, though, the current process isn't working very well. When there's a trifecta, that's where one party is in control of the entire government, the state house, the state senate, and the governor's seat, plus in this case the Supreme Court. That happened in 2011. You get gerrymandering. When there's divided government between the House and the Senate and the governor, which Pennsylvania has now, with the House and governor in one party and the Senate in the other, you get a stalemate in drawing the lines for the congressional seats. And you get litigation and court appeals. And in fact, 4 of the 5 members of the Legislative Redistricting Committee are partisan political leaders These are going to be side deals, which distort the process. These side deals have been nicknamed buddy mandate. Let's look at that a little bit. This happened recently in the state Senate, where a roughly 50-50 split between the actual number of votes cast for each party in the 2024 election produced an uneven split of 28 to 22 in the senators actually elected in favor of the Republicans. What was going on was a form of protection for existing senators. You know, no elected legislator wants to be suddenly placed in a newly drawn district where the party split may favor their opponent, and where they're not well known by the voters, or where they may have to run against a member of their own party. This is a concern shared by members of both parties. So some horse trading goes on privately. Each party agrees to draw the lines to protect specific incumbents of the other party, and vice versa. It's pretty clear that happened in 2024. Here's an example. The current state Senate map is a buddy mandate, drawn to protect the status quo for both parties. Very little public and expert testimony was taken. Then both the Senate leaders on the commission, one Republican and one Democrat, one for each party, retired for backroom discussions, where they discarded all public input and drew their own within the Senate maps. So here you're looking at Lehigh County, circled in red. Its population size would qualify it to have 1.4 state senators. Well, you can't have a fraction of the senators, so you'd expect they'd have one senator entirely within their district and another covering part of their district. Instead, they got three. Senator Miller in District 14, a Democrat, got the Allentown metro area. That's in yellow here. See it sticking there inside Lehigh County. He got the Allentown metro area. And that put additional Democrats in his district, making it easier to get reelected. Same for another Democrat, Senator Moscola in District 18, shown in orange on the right. That area right there, recruiting into Lehigh County. You got Bethlehem, and it's mostly Democratic voters. Then the Republican, in District 16, shown in green, that was Pat Brown, who lived in a heavily Democratic Allentown and needed more Republican voters. He got a special extension of his district to include his home. That's the little green peninsula you see right there. And an otherwise yellow Allentown. Here's a closer look. That little black dot is actually a flag. That's Pat Brown's home. He was a Republican senator for District 16, shown in gray here at the time. Allentown, shown in the blue border lines, was split so that his home would land in the gray area, the more conservative rural district around Allentown, and made the seat safer. Well, it didn't work too well because, as it turned out, this arrangement turned up with Senator Brown losing his primary. However, it was still a Republican district, the gray area, and winner of that Republican primary, Senator Jared Coleman, did carry the day. Now, next door to us here in Montgomery County, based on its population, it should have between 3 and 4 Senate districts. Instead, it has 6, and only one is entirely within the county limits. And it certainly has, this District 12 certainly has a gerrymandered look to it. It sort of sprawls around. This is District 12. Now, closer to home, here's District 7, which is our own district. Here in Roxborough, it's occupied by Senator Vincent Hughes. It also extends into Montgomery County. Indeed, it starts down by the Art Museum, by the A in Philadelphia, and runs along the Schuylkill River to Conshohocken. Well, actually, first it goes into West Philadelphia, then it turns north into Roxborough, where we are, runs along the Schuylkill River to Conshohocken, passing Cathedral Village, after which it turns east and heads toward Bucks County. All told, it winds up some 20 miles from the start. And the result is that Senator Hughes has an awkward and a very diverse district to represent, with very divergent interests: urban and rural, black and white, affluent and poor, and a lot of ground to cover to reach all its corners. What this means is that when it comes to issues affecting matters at the county level, particularly at the county level, these senators have to focus on many different communities in 2 or more counties, which dilutes their focus. So, we come to 2020, the redistricting process, that's the most recent redistricting. It didn't change, the process didn't change, despite efforts to bring change about. The public attention worked. Attention to gerrymandering and the redistricting process led to the appointment of a less partisan and very competent redistricting chair, Mark Wardenberg. He was able to make the entire process more transparent. For example, the redistricting panel held hearings across the state and invited public input. New maps more accurately reflected the voting preferences of Pennsylvania statewide, as did the election results, which included the largest freshman class of legislators in decades. So increasingly, the states are turning to independent redistricting commissions to draw their electoral districts. They're removing or limiting direct involvement by elected officials, reducing partisan gerrymandering. The specific structure and authority of these commissions can vary, but independent commissions are defined as those where politicians and legislative staff are prohibited from serving as members of the commission. And the commission itself has final authority over the maps. Most of the ones you see here are recent. 8 states now have independent redistricting commissions, and 3 more have created commissions that are partly independent, but not fully free from political involvement. Those latter ones function to create maps, and though they're not in control of the final result, they have important influence in the process. So the consensus developing is that Pennsylvania needs a similar independent citizens redistricting commission. Over the past several elections, I've been active at the polls, getting voters to sign a petition asking for such a commission, and I found that a large majority of voters understand about gerrymandering, and they do sign the petition. Such a commission must be created by an amendment to the Pennsylvania Constitution. Cannot be created by ordinary legislation. Well, it could be, but that can be overturned at the whim of the legislature. Pennsylvania does not have the initiative and referendum process. If you're familiar with some other states, you may be familiar with the fact that you can get enough signatures on a petition, it has to be put to a vote at the next election. In Pennsylvania, we don't have that, and our Constitution is very difficult to amend. The only way is to have a bill introduced and passed by both houses in not 1 but 2 consecutive 2-year sessions of the General Assembly, and with identical wording both times. This is a challenge. The commission itself must be made up of registered voters, excluding holders of elected office and their family members and their staffs. Those persons would be ineligible to serve. The process has to be transparent, no dealing behind closed doors, meetings must be open. Reports have to be shared with the public. Hearings held, comments solicited at each step. And the work to be accomplished without delays on a set schedule. Now, as mentioned, these commissions are working successfully in a number of other states. This past election, independent commissions through 82 of the 435 House districts. It's about 20%, and it is growing. So legislation has been introduced in Pennsylvania. In the state Senate, it's Senate Bill 131. In the House, it's House Bill 31. Identical wording in both bills. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the actual commission, but here's a little bit. This proposed commission would come into being in the year of the federal census. That would be 2030, consist of 11 members, as shown here, illustrated with buckets. 4 are registered with the largest party, 4 with the second largest party, and 3 not registered with the major party. That is, that third group would be independents and third-party members. And the commission has to reflect Pennsylvania's geographic, ethnic, racial, and gender diversity. Essentially, and I can go into this further if we have time later, but it's very wonky. But essentially, people apply, and hundreds, probably thousands of people say they'd like to be on the commission. There's then some sorting that goes on by the State Department, which figures out who's eligible, who's not eligible, and make basic decisions whether the people seem literate enough to be able to participate. And then it goes through a random selection, kind of like the lottery. So among the dozens or hundreds of people who are being selected, nobody can control who comes out in the lottery. And that narrows it down. And then eventually it works out with the portion you see here. Four from the major party, from the largest party, 4 from the next largest party, and 3 independent. So looking ahead, the next census occurs in 2030, and the next redistricting will come about in 2031. And will result in a 2032 election reflecting new districts. This may seem a long way off, and the temptation, of course, is to leave it to a future generation. However, actions needed now to help make sure the districts are going correctly in 2031. Timing is critical. In order to be ready for the 2030 census, the legislation has to pass first in the current session, and again in the 2027 to 28 session. It would then go on the ballot for November 2028, or possibly 2029 as a fallback vote. If all goes well, it's approved by the voters. The commission would then take charge of the redistricting process based on the 2030 census. So the time is tight. You can see the problem here. So many of us are focused on what's going on in Washington, what's going to happen tomorrow or next week, that we aren't paying attention to the long haul. And we need to fight that short-sightedness. But this has to happen over the long haul. The initial steps beginning this year or 2026, and then moving forward from there. So, by the way, here are 2 legislators who will have a role in deciding the fate of the constitutional amendment. I'm curious, how many of you know Representative Tarek Khan, who we've seen him participated in some of his town halls? State Senator Vincent Hughes, how many know Vincent Hughes? About the same, maybe a few less. Both of them came to a town hall that I attended last week in Roxborough, along with 3 other Fair Districts volunteers with me. And we asked both of them to co-sponsor the redistricting constitutional amendment. Senator Hughes demurred and said he'd have to look into it. He knows what it's about, but he didn't bother with it. And interesting that Tarek Khan had the concern that most legislators have, at least in the back of their minds. That's the risk of being redistricted out of your current district. And it's pretty clear that others might feel the same way. He had an interesting solution, which would be to let a legislator who's in that situation run maybe just once from outside their district, if you could just push to the edge of somebody else's district. It's an interesting idea. It would undoubtedly appeal to other incumbent legislators, but whether it would gain acceptance or even be constitutional, that would have to be determined. Okay, we'll stop here for a minute, see if you have any thoughts, comments, questions. It's a lot of detail.
It seems to me that since software is available to redistrict, anyway, I mean, that's conceivable. It should be also possible from a software standpoint, using the census data to come up with a fair districting. So wouldn't it be possible to take this entire redistricting out of the hands of individuals and turn it over to the Census Bureau and have the Census Bureau tell the politician, these are your new districts?
Yeah, your problem is you have to get the legislators to agree to that. And the legislators don't agree. Really, public pressure is about the only thing that gets that to change. But interestingly, the Committee of 70, in the last, when the last redistricting was going on, ran a contest, and they invited citizens to draw their own maps from all over the state. And they had hundreds of maps submitted. Most of them were pretty good. The best one was actually drawn by a school teacher in her 20s who produced a really beautiful map, and it circulated and gave it a lot of publicity. The legislators turned their head the other way and good maps that they wanted to have. But the mere fact of having all these hundreds of maps drawn and all this excitement around the state, there were some awards given to people who do the best maps, got people to think about it and got people to put some pressure on their legislators. And why can't you draw a map like that? So,
Charlie, are you optimistic?
yes, I am optimistic. A couple of ways to look at it. I am hopeful and a little bit optimistic that this constitutional amendment can go all the way through. But it might get changed. It might turn out that we get an advisory commission rather than a fully empowered commission. And whatever you get, if there's discussion and excitement and people are participating, it makes it very hard for the legislators to go into the back room and draw their own outrageous maps. So, can't say for sure, but I think something will come of it. Okay, well, any other questions? We've got a little time. There's maybe a few other things that you might be interested in. Here's a summary of legislation now in Harrisburg that affects elections redistricting. The redistricting commission we've already discussed. That's one. Then there's the Voting Rights Protection Act. That's in Harrisburg now. Key provisions. It creates in-person early voting starting more than a week before Election Day. It expands access to ballot drop boxes. It allows counties to begin processing mail-in ballots up to a week before Election Day. Instead of waiting for Election Day, the way it is right now, all these ballots that came in the weeks before can't be touched until Election Day. And then frantically, the elections board staff has to try to pull it all together and get their counts. Quite unnecessary. It also permits voters to correct minor errors on mail-in ballots. They're allowed to notify the voter that you put the wrong date in or something, and you can come and correct that. This is passed in the House, but in the Senate, its fate is uncertain. House Bill 771, the voter ID requirement, requires all voters to present identification at the polls. This is a Republican concern. It expands the types of acceptable identification, making requirements a little more lenient than in previous Republican-backed proposals, which makes it a little more acceptable to Democrats. The sponsorship is bipartisan, but it's primarily Republican. It has advanced from committee to the House floor, meaning that it's poised for a vote. Just have to watch and see if it goes anywhere. These two bills that I've just described reflect the tendency among Democrats to want to expand the vote, and among Republicans to worry about the security of elections. So we say, although many would say the real concern is to hold the vote down, figuring that would benefit Republicans. Then there's House Bill 280, primary election reform. That's been introduced in the House. It would amend the state election code, provide for independent voters to cast primary ballots for party candidates. That would weaken the role of the party organizations in the primaries, and it could bring both candidates from both parties to campaign toward the political center to attract those independent voters, rather than to the extremes, which is the tendency today. Going to take a big lift to get that through the General Assembly. And those are kind of the major ones. Any questions or thoughts about that? Jim?
Is there any important differences or similarities to other democratic countries? In other words, Canada or England, or is that even important?
I haven't studied up on that a lot, but my impression is, and I haven't seen articles about it, that in most other countries, the districting is not done by the legislature. It's done by citizens, and it's done by some kind of independent body. But I don't have the details on that. It's a good question. My impression is that we pretty much stand alone in the way we do it.
Does an open primary just mean that independents can vote, or does it mean that I, as a Democrat, could vote one person for one person who is a Republican and one person who is an independent, and, you know, in the different categories?
Well, my understanding is you would, when you arrive at the polls, you would have to say what party you wanted to be part of for that election. So if you're independent and you show up at the polls and you say, I'm a Democrat, you would get a Democratic ballot. And you would make your choices on that ballot. If you were Republican, you would get a Republican ballot.
So that is what the open primary would be?
That would be the way an open primary would.
Okay.
Well, we got a few minutes. I'll give you a little overview of around the United States. Gerrymandering is still alive and flourishing around the country. So this map will give you an idea of what's going on. In the map, green is good, yellow is better than average, brown is average, and red is poor. There's a few in light blue. That's where there's insufficient data. This map is a couple of years old. There's changes going on all the time. But here's a few specifics around the U.S. In Alabama, a recent congressional map was held by the Supreme Court to be a racial gerrymander. And as a result, an extra majority black district was created. That was a case where packing went on. A lot of minority voters packed into one district, so that got split up again. In Michigan, they got an independent citizens commission, and that was approved by the referendum process, which unfortunately we don't have here. The voters overwhelmingly wanted the referendum, and the referendum passed. Minnesota ended prison gerrymandering. That's a different form of gerrymandering. The situation there is that when a lot of the people who are convicted of crimes come from urban areas, a lot of the prisons are in rural areas. So if the people who represent rural areas, that's predominantly Republicans, if they control the legislature, they set it up in such a way that those prisons are counted as being in a rural county, not in their home county. We had that in Pennsylvania, too. They managed to change that in Minnesota, and we have changed it somewhat in Pennsylvania. It's not entirely changed, but you know, when you've got a legislature that is only a majority of one person, a little bit of a change like that can flip the legislature. So in Virginia, Virginia's like us. There's only one way to get a constitutional amendment. You have to go through this very elaborate process that takes several years, and winds up in a referendum. That worked in Virginia. They got it to happen. They have a bipartisan commission. Now, unfortunately, it's advisory, which means that the politicians can overrule it. In Wisconsin, the recently drawn maps are fair maps, but they were challenged in the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. And the good news, if you followed a few months ago, there was a very critical election. Elon Musk spent millions of dollars trying to get a conservative elected to the Supreme Court. That failed, and the liberal was elected. And the expectation is that those revised lines will be upheld by the state Supreme Court. So, negative stuff. Although hopeful, in Florida, they took action to pack a lot of black voters into a single district in there, and there's a lawsuit currently in progress alleging that was a racial gerrymander, not allowed. Georgia, new maps, split racial minorities up. That's cracking, taking a good minority district and splitting it up in such a way that they all favor the other party. That's political, not racial gerrymandering, so that's allowed now by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, if Georgia wants to do that, they can do it. Now, Louisiana, there's a turnabout there. There are non-black voters challenging the creation of a second majority black district. They're trying to get it to go the other way. North Carolina, current federal lawsuits allege racial gerrymandering by the Republican legislature. That's in progress. That's in court now. So who knows which way that'll go. There's also a trial underway in Texas challenging current maps as diluting Black and Hispanic voting power. Again, just have to see where those go. Keep your eye on those things. Okay, well, that's what I have to say today. We've got time for questions.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Any final question? Thanks for coming.